Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. 1874, Ozark Mountains, 12. Miners entered the caves. None returned alive. In the autumn of 1874, deep within the limestone caverns of the Ozark Mountains, 12 men descended into darkness and never returned to tell their tale. Their names have been whispered in hushed tones for over a century. Their fate sealed somewhere in the endless tunnels that snake beneath Missouri's rugged landscape. What happened in those caves remains one of the most chilling mysteries of the American frontier. The morning mist clung to the hillsides like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the ancient limestone formations that had stood sentinel over the Ozark wilderness for millions of years. It was October 15th, 1874. And the changing leaves painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds. But beneath this beautiful facade lay something far more sinister, a network of caves so vast and complex that even the most experienced explorers spoke of them in whispers. Local residents had long harbored a deep unease about these particular caves. Unlike the gentle tourist attractions that would one day bring visitors from across the nation, these caverns carried an aura of dread that seemed to seep from their very walls. The Cherokee who once roamed these lands had avoided the caves entirely, passing down stories that spoke of spirits trapped in eternal darkness, of voices that called out from the depths to lure the living into the cold underworld. But on that fateful October morning, desperation outweighed superstition. The economic pressures following the Civil War had left many families struggling to survive, and the promise of mineral wealth hidden in the earth's belly was too tempting to ignore. 12 men, each carrying the weight of hungry families and mounting debts, gathered at the cave entrance with their mining equipment, their flickering torches casting dancing shadows on the limestone walls. The cave mouth itself was an imposing sight. A jagged opening in the mountainside that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of some sleeping giant. Local folklore claimed that on quiet nights you could hear the mountain exhaling, releasing the accumulated sorrows of all who had entered and never emerged. The entrance was partially hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and twisted vines, as if nature itself was trying to seal away whatever lay within. As the 12 miners stood at the threshold between the world of the living and the realm of eternal darkness, none could have imagined that they were about to become part of a legend that would haunt the Ozarks for generations to come. The mountain seemed to watch them with ancient, patient eyes, waiting to claim its newest victims in a tragedy that would shake the very foundations of the surrounding communities. The last anyone saw of them alive was their lantern light disappearing into the cave's hungry maw, swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed to have a physical presence of its own. By nightfall, when they failed to return, the first whispers of concern began to circulate among their families. By the next morning, those whispers had grown into cries of alarm that would echo through the valleys and hollers of the Ozark Mountains. But to understand the full weight of this tragedy, we must first journey back to the world these men inhabited. A world shaped by war, hardship, and the relentless struggle for survival that defined the American frontier in the 1870s. The Ozark Mountains, in 1874, were a land caught between past and future, where the echoes of the Civil War still reverberated through communities trying to rebuild their shattered lives. This was frontier America at its most raw and unforgiving, where survival depended on courage, cunning, and an intimate knowledge of the harsh landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. The war had ended nearly a decade earlier, but its scars ran deep through Missouri and Arkansas. Families had been torn apart, not just by the conflict itself, but by the bitter divisions that lingered long after the last shot was fired. In the isolated communities scattered throughout the Ozark wilderness, these wounds festered like untreated infections, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and desperation that colored every aspect of daily life. Towns like Eureka Springs in Arkansas and Lebanon in Missouri served as vital lifelines for the scattered homesteads and mining camps that dotted the region. Eureka Springs, with its natural springs that were believed to possess healing properties, had begun to attract visitors from across the South seeking relief from various ailments. The town's wooden boardwalks echoed with the footsteps of hopeful invalids and the merchants who catered to their needs. Lebanon, Missouri, meanwhile, had become a crucial stop along the expanding railroad network that was slowly penetrating the Ozark wilderness. The arrival of the railroad brought both opportunity and change, connecting these isolated communities to markets in St. Louis and Kansas City, while also introducing outside influences that many locals viewed with deep suspicion. Governor Silas Woodson of Missouri, who had taken office in 1873, was actively promoting economic recovery throughout the state. His administration encouraged mining, logging, and agricultural development as ways to restore Missouri's prosperity in the aftermath of the war. Woodson's policies created a climate of optimism about the region's natural resources, leading many desperate families to pin their hopes on extracting wealth from the earth itself. The limestone caves that honeycomb the Ozark Mountains had long been recognized as potential sources of both mineral wealth and commercial opportunity. Cave formations like those found at Onondaga Cave, which had been documented by early explorers in the 1800s, revealed the geological complexity of the region. These caverns, carved over millions of years by underground rivers, contained deposits of lead, zinc, and other valuable minerals that could provide financial salvation for struggling families. But mining in the Ozarks was never simply a matter of economics. It was intimately connected to the folklore and superstitions that had grown up around these ancient caves. The Cherokee, who had lived in harmony with this landscape for centuries before being forced westward, had developed an elaborate mythology around the underground realm. They spoke of the caves as gateways to the spirit world, places where the boundary between life and death became dangerously thin. European settlers had brought their own superstitions to the Ozarks, blending them with Native American beliefs to create a unique folklore that emphasized the dangers lurking beneath the Earth's surface. Stories circulated of miners who had ventured too deep and discovered chambers filled with the bones of ancient peoples, or underground rivers that flowed backward, defying the natural order of things. The economic desperation that gripped the region in the 1870s made people willing to take risks they might otherwise have avoided. Families that had lost everything during the war saw mining as their last chance to reclaim some measure of prosperity. The promise of mineral wealth hidden in the caves was particularly appealing because it required relatively little capital investment, just basic tools, some rope, and the courage to descend into the darkness. This combination of economic necessity and supernatural dread created a perfect storm of circumstances that would ultimately lead to the tragedy of October 1874. The 12 men who gathered at the cave entrance that fateful morning were products of this harsh environment, shaped by years of struggle and hardship that had made them willing to risk everything for the chance of a better life. Among these 12 men were fathers and sons, brothers and neighbors, each carrying his own burden of responsibility and hope. Their backgrounds reflected the diverse population that had settled in the Ozarks over the decades, drawn by the promise of cheap land and the opportunity to start fresh in a region far removed from the industrial centers of the East. Thomas McKinnon, the eldest of the group at 43, had served as a sergeant in the Missouri State Guard during the early years of the Civil War. The conflict had left him with a pronounced limp from a bullet wound received at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, but it had also given him the leadership experience that made him the natural choice to guide the mining expedition. McKinnon's wife, Sarah, had borne him 4 children, and the family's small farm near Lebanon was barely producing enough to keep them fed through the harsh Ozark winters. His younger brother, James McKinnon, had followed Thomas into military service, but had emerged from the war with wounds that were less visible but no less debilitating. The 28-year-old struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and sudden fits of rage that made it difficult for him to maintain steady employment. The prospect of mining offered James a chance to work alongside his brother, while potentially earning enough money to support his pregnant wife, Mary, and their 2 young daughters. Johann Müller represented the German immigrant population that had settled throughout the Ozarks in search of agricultural opportunities. The 35-year-old had arrived in Missouri in 1868 with dreams of establishing a successful farm, but a series of crop failures and harsh winters had left his family destitute. Müller spoke English with a heavy accent that some locals found suspicious, but his reputation for hard work and reliability had earned him acceptance in the community. His wife, Greta, supplemented the family's meager income by taking in laundry, while their 3 children helped tend the family's struggling vegetable garden. Ezekiel Thompson and his son, David, represented the complex racial dynamics of post-Civil War Missouri. Ezekiel had been born into slavery on a plantation near Springfield, but had gained his freedom during the war and had worked tirelessly to establish himself as an independent farmer. Despite facing constant discrimination and occasional violence from white neighbors, he had managed to purchase 20 acres of rocky hillside land where he grew corn and raised a few head of cattle. His 19-year-old son, David, had been born free, but had grown up understanding that his opportunities were severely limited by the color of his skin. For both men, mining represented a chance to earn money in an endeavor where success would be measured by courage and skill rather than social status. The O'Malley brothers, Patrick and Sean, had fled the potato famine in Ireland during the 1840s and had spent the intervening decades working their way westward across America. Patrick, now 39, had established himself as a blacksmith in a small community south of Lebanon, while Sean, 31, had tried his hand at farming with limited success. Both men possessed the combination of physical strength and mechanical aptitude that made them valuable additions to any mining venture. Their wives, Bridget and Colleen, had bonded over their shared struggles to maintain Irish Catholic traditions in a predominantly Protestant region. William Harrison, despite sharing a name with a former president, came from decidedly humble origins. The 26-year-old had been orphaned during a cholera outbreak in 1867 and had survived by doing odd jobs throughout the Ozarks. His lack of family ties made him willing to take risks that others might avoid, and his knowledge of the local terrain, gained through years of wandering, made him a valuable guide for the expedition. Benjamin Carter had arrived in the Ozarks as a circuit-riding preacher, but his growing family and declining donations had forced him to seek additional sources of income. The 41-year-old struggled with the moral implications of abandoning his ministerial duties for the pursuit of worldly wealth, but his wife's chronic illness required medicines that his meager church salary couldn't provide. Carter's presence in the group added a spiritual dimension to the expedition, though some wondered whether his participation might actually bring divine judgment upon the venture. Samuel Wright, at just 22, was the youngest member of the group and the most eager to prove himself among these older, more experienced men. His father had died fighting for the Union at Gettysburg, leaving Samuel to support his mother and 3 younger sisters. The young man's enthusiasm for the mining venture was tempered by an underlying anxiety about living up to his father's memory and fulfilling his responsibilities as the family's sole provider. Finally, there was Jeremiah Stone, a mysterious figure who had arrived in the area just months earlier with little explanation of his background or intentions. Stone claimed to have mining experience from the California gold fields, and his knowledge of geological formations had convinced the others to include him in their venture. However, his secretive nature and reluctance to discuss his past had created an undercurrent of suspicion that would later take on sinister significance when the expedition went wrong. These 12 men, bound together by desperation and hope in equal measure, had spent weeks planning their descent into the caves. They had pooled their limited resources to purchase rope, pickaxes, shovels, and enough oil to keep their lamps burning for what they estimated would be a 3-day expedition. Their plan was to explore the cave system systematically, mapping the passages while searching for mineral deposits that might justify a larger mining operation. As they prepared for their journey into the Earth's depths, none of them could have imagined that they were about to become part of a mystery that would haunt the Ozarks for generations to come. The mountain waited patiently, as it had for millennia, ready to claim 12 more souls in its endless hunger for human sacrifice. On the morning of October 15th, 1874, the mist that shrouded the Ozark Mountains seemed thicker than usual, clinging to the limestone cliffs like the breath of some ancient, sleeping giant. The air carried the crisp promise of winter, though the changing leaves still blazed with autumn fire across the rolling hills that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The 12 miners gathered at the cave entrance just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the forest canopy. Their equipment lay spread across the rocky ground, coils of hemp rope, canvas bags filled with tools, and a collection of oil lamps that would serve as their only source of light in the absolute darkness that awaited them below. Thomas McKinnon stood at the cave mouth, studying the jagged opening that disappeared into the hillside like the throat of some primordial beast. The entrance was larger than most people realized, nearly 8 feet high and 12 feet wide at its broadest point. Limestone formations created natural columns on either side, carved by millions of years of water flow that had shaped the mountain's hidden architecture. The cave's mouth exhaled a constant stream of cool, damp air that carried the mineral scent of deep earth and something else, something indefinable that made the hair on the back of one's neck stand on end. Local Cherokee traditions spoke of caves as breathing places, where the earth itself inhaled the spirits of the dead and exhaled the essence of the underworld. "Gentlemen," Thomas called out, his voice echoing slightly off the limestone walls, "we all know why we're here. Our families are counting on us to find something down there that'll change our fortunes. But I want everyone to understand. Once we go in, we stay together. No one wanders off on their own, no matter what we find." The miners nodded solemnly, each man checking his equipment one final time. Johann Mueller tested the strength of his rope by wrapping it around a sturdy tree and pulling with all his weight. The O'Malley brothers ensured their pickaxes were securely fastened to their belts, while Benjamin Carter clutched a small leather Bible that he planned to carry throughout the expedition. Jeremiah Stone stood slightly apart from the others, his experienced eyes scanning the cave entrance with an intensity that made some of the group uncomfortable. "I've been caves and caves from California to Colorado," he announced, his voice carrying an authority born of experience. "This one's got the right feel to it. The airflow tells me there's a significant system down there, probably connects to underground rivers that have been carving tunnels for thousands of years." Samuel Wright, eager to prove his worth among these older men, volunteered to carry the group's spare lamp oil. His youthful enthusiasm was infectious, but Thomas McKinnon noticed how the young man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his equipment. The weight of responsibility, for his mother and sisters, for proving himself worthy of his father's memory, was clearly taking its toll. Ezekiel Thompson and his son David had positioned themselves near the rear of the group, a defensive arrangement born of years of experience in situations where being first could mean being blamed if things went wrong. Despite their caution, both men were determined to seize this opportunity to improve their family's circumstances regardless of the risks involved. As the group prepared to enter the cave, William Harrison shared some disturbing folklore he had gathered during his years of wandering the Ozarks. The Cherokee who used to hunt these mountains had a name for this particular cave system, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They called it the mouth that swallows light, said it was where the spirits of the dead went to forget their earthly sorrows. Benjamin Carter frowned at this information, clearly troubled by its implications. "Perhaps we should offer a prayer before we begin," he suggested, pulling out his Bible. "The Lord protects those who trust in his guidance." Some of the men bowed their heads respectfully, while others shifted uncomfortably, more concerned with practical matters than spiritual protection. The growing tension between faith and dogmatism would become a recurring theme throughout their descent into the earth's hidden chambers. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Thomas McKinnon lit the first lamp and stepped across the threshold into the cave. The limestone walls immediately closed around the group, creating an intimate space that amplified every sound: the shuffle of boots on stone, the whisper of clothing against rock, and the steady drip of water from somewhere deeper in the mountain. The initial passage was relatively spacious, carved by an ancient underground river that had long since changed its course. The walls bore the smooth, undulating patterns typical of water erosion, creating surfaces that seemed to flow like frozen rapids. Their lamplight revealed formations of extraordinary beauty, flowstone curtains that hung like petrified waterfalls, and delicate soda straws that projected from the ceiling like crystalline icicles. For the first 100 yards, the passage sloped gently downward, following what had once been the river's natural course. The miners' boots found secure footing on the limestone floor, though they had to duck occasionally to avoid low-hanging formations. Their voices echoed strangely in the enclosed space, sometimes seeming to come from directions other than where the speakers actually stood. Johann Müller, with his practical German sensibilities, had brought along a compass and was carefully noting their direction of travel. "We're heading almost due north," he reported, "following what looks like a natural fault in the rock. This passage could go on for miles." As they progressed deeper into the mountain, the passage began to branch into multiple tunnels, each leading off into darkness that their lamplight couldn't penetrate. Stone formations became more elaborate, creating chambers of cathedral-like grandeur where their footsteps echoed for long seconds before fading into silence. It was in one of these chambers that they made their first Camp discovery. Jeremiah Stone, who had been examining the walls for signs of mineral deposits, called the group's attention to a section where the limestone showed clear streaks of lead ore. The dark veins ran through the rock like frozen lightning, promising the kind of wealth that had drawn them into the mountain in the first place. "This is it," Stone announced, his voice thick with excitement. "This is what we've been looking for. There's enough ore in this wall alone to keep us busy for months." The discovery energized the entire group, validating their decision to risk the dangers of cave exploration. Tools were unpacked, and the men began to examine the ore deposits more closely, discussing the logistics of extraction and transportation. For a brief moment, the mountain's oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, replaced by the infectious optimism of men who believed their fortunes were about to change. But as they worked, examining the mineral deposits by lamplight, subtle changes began to occur in their environment. The air seemed to grow thicker, more difficult to breathe. The steady drip of water that had accompanied them throughout their descent began to take on an irregular rhythm, almost like a coded message tapped out by unseen hands. David Thompson was the first to notice that their voices were behaving strangely. Words spoken in normal tones would sometimes fade to whispers before reaching the listener's ears, while other sounds, the scrape of metal against stone, the rustle of clothing, seemed amplified to unnatural volumes. "Something's not right about this place," he whispered to his father Ezekiel. "It feels like the mountain itself is listening to us." The older man nodded grimly. Years of navigating a hostile world had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming warnings about their current situation. But the promise of mineral wealth was too compelling to abandon based on mere feelings of unease. As the day wore on, the miners pushed deeper into the cave system, following passages that seemed to branch and reconnect in patterns that defied easy mapping. Their lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the periphery of their vision. More than once, someone would turn quickly, convinced they had seen something lurking just beyond the reach of their light, only to find empty darkness staring back at them. By late afternoon, they had penetrated nearly a mile into the mountain, farther than any of them had originally planned to venture on their first day. The ore deposits they had discovered were extensive enough to justify their risks, but the psychological toll of spending so many hours in the absolute darkness of the underground world was beginning to affect the entire group. It was then that they heard the sound, a low, rhythmic groaning that seemed to come from the very heart of the mountain itself. At first, they attributed it to the natural settling of rock under immense geological pressure. But as the sound continued, rising and falling in patterns that suggested some form of primitive communication, the miners began to look at each other with growing alarm. "We should head back," Samuel Wright suggested, his youthful bravado finally cracking under the strain of their increasingly unnerving environment. "We've found what we came for. We can return tomorrow with better equipment." But Jeremiah Stone, driven by an obsession that the others were only beginning to understand, insisted they press on. "There's something else down here," he declared, his eyes reflecting the lamp flame with an intensity that made his companions uncomfortable. "Something more valuable than lead ore. I can feel it calling to us." And so, against the better judgment of several group members, the 12 miners continued their descent into the depths of the mountain, following passages that grew progressively narrower and more treacherous. None of them realized that they were walking deeper into a mystery that would consume not only their lives, but the peace of mind of everyone who knew them. The mountain seemed to close around them like a living thing, its ancient patience finally rewarded with 12 new souls to add to its collection. In the world above, the sun was setting over the Ozark Hills, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed ominous to those who understood that the miners should have returned hours ago. As darkness fell over the Ozark Mountains on October 15, 1874, the families and friends of the 12 miners began their long vigil of waiting. What had started as routine concern for men who were slightly late returning from work gradually transformed into a growing sense of dread that would soon grip the entire region. Sarah McKinnon was the first to raise the alarm. As the wife of Thomas McKinnon, the expedition's leader, she had expected her husband to return by sunset with news of their discoveries. When full darkness fell, and still there was no sign of the mining party, she walked to the homes of the other families, her anxiety growing with each stop. Mary McKinnon, heavily pregnant with her third child, tried to maintain optimism despite her own growing fears. They probably found something significant and lost track of time, she told Sarah, though her pale complexion betrayed her true feelings. You know how men get when they're excited about a discovery. But Greta Müller, Johann's practical German wife, was less willing to accept such reassurances. Johann promised he would be home for dinner, she said firmly. In 15 years of marriage, he has never broken such a promise. Something is wrong. Word spread quickly through the scattered communities surrounding the cave site. In an era when communication depended on horseback messengers and word-of-mouth networks, news of the missing miners traveled with surprising speed. By midnight, search parties were already forming in Lebanon and the surrounding settlements. The local sheriff, a grizzled Civil War veteran named Marcus Donnelly, organized the initial search effort. Donnelly had seen enough tragedy during his years as a lawman to understand that quick action often meant the difference between rescue and recovery. He assembled a group of 20 volunteers, including several men who had previous experience with cave exploration. "We go in at first light," Donnelly announced to the assembled searchers. "We follow their planned route and look for any sign of what happened. But nobody goes off alone. Caves have a way of claiming more victims when people panic." Among the volunteers was Dr. Henry Caldwell, the region's only physician, who brought medical supplies in case the miners were found injured but alive. Caldwell had treated his share of mining accidents over the years and knew that cave-ins, poisonous gases, and equipment failures could all result in situations where immediate medical attention might save lives. Reverend Joshua Matthews, the Methodist minister who served several communities in the area, joined the search party despite having no cave experience. His presence was intended to provide comfort to the families and to perform last rites if the worst fears proved justified. Matthews carried a small wooden cross that had been blessed at the regional Methodist conference, believing that divine protection might be necessary in the dark places beneath the earth. As dawn broke on October 16th, the search party gathered at the cave entrance where the miners had begun their expedition just 24 hours earlier. The scene bore clear evidence of their passage. Disturbed earth where equipment had been sorted, rope marks on trees where they had tested their gear, and the lingering scent of lamp oil in the morning air. Sheriff Donnelly examined the cave mouth carefully, looking for any clues that might indicate what had happened to the missing men. The limestone entrance appeared unchanged, exhaling its constant stream of cool, damp air that carried no hint of the tragedy that lay hidden in its depths. "Their tracks are clear enough," reported Jake Morrison, a local hunter whose tracking skills had proven valuable in previous search efforts. 12 sets of boot prints heading into the cave, all walking normally. No sign of struggle or panic at the entrance. The search party entered the cave in single file, following the same route the miners had taken the day before. Their progress was slower than the original expeditions had been, as they stopped frequently to examine the walls and floor for any sign of the missing men. The first significant discovery came about 300 yards into the cave system. William Patterson, one of the volunteer searchers, found a pickaxe embedded in the limestone wall next to a promising vein of lead ore. The tool had been abandoned in the middle of what appeared to be active mining work, as if the person using it had simply stopped mid-swing and walked away. "This doesn't make sense," Patterson muttered, examining the abandoned tool. "Nobody leaves good equipment behind unless something's forcing them to move fast." Dr. Caldwell studied the scene with a physician's eye for detail. "There's no blood on the tool or the surrounding rock," he observed. "Whatever caused them to abandon this work, it wasn't an injury." As the search party pushed deeper into the cave system, they found more evidence of the miners' presence: rope anchored to stone formations, tool marks on promising ore deposits, and footprints in the soft clay that covered portions of the cave floor. But they also discovered something more disturbing. The deeper they went, the more disorganized the miners' activities appeared to become. In one chamber, They found a coil of rope that had been cut rather than untied, as if someone had been in too much of a hurry to bother with proper knots. In another passage, they discovered several oil lamps that had been extinguished and abandoned, still containing fuel that could have provided hours of additional light. Reverend Matthews was particularly troubled by what he saw as evidence of growing panic among the missing men. "These are signs of people who were running from something," he told Sheriff Donnelly. But what could have frightened 12 grown men so badly that they would abandon their equipment? The most disturbing discovery came nearly a mile into the cave system, in a chamber where the walls bore clear evidence of extensive mining activity. Here, the search party found clear signs that the miners had been working systematically to extract ore from a particularly rich vein in the limestone. But scattered around the chamber floor were personal belongings that no miner would willingly abandon: pocket watches, a leather wallet containing family photographs, and a small silver cross that Bridget O'Malley later identified as belonging to her husband Patrick. Dr. Caldwell picked up the cross with trembling hands, noting that the chain appeared to have been broken rather than unfastened. "This suggests sudden violent movement," he said quietly, as if someone had grabbed the wearer and pulled hard enough to snap the chain. But perhaps most unsettling of all was what they found scratched into the limestone wall near the abandoned mining site. Someone, presumably one of the missing miners, had used a metal tool to carve a single word into the rock: "Run." The message was crude but unmistakable, carved with the desperate urgency of someone trying to warn others of imminent danger. Below it, in what appeared to be the same handwriting, were additional scratches that might have been the beginning of another word, but the markings were too damaged to decipher. Sheriff Donnelly studied the carved warning with growing unease. In his years of law enforcement, he had seen many crime scenes, but something about this particular message filled him with a dread he couldn't explain. What were they running from, he wondered aloud. And why didn't they make it out? As the search party continued deeper into the cave system, following the increasingly erratic trail left by the missing miners, they began to experience some of the same unsettling phenomena that had apparently affected their predecessors. Sounds echoed strangely in the enclosed spaces, sometimes seeming to come from directions other than their sources. The air grew thicker and more oppressive, making it difficult to breathe normally. Most disturbing of all, several members of the search party reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision, shadowy forms that seemed to dart just beyond the reach of their lamplight. When they turned to investigate, they found nothing but empty darkness staring back at them. "This place has an evil feel to it," whispered Tom Bradley, a farmer who had volunteered for the search despite having no cave experience. "It's like the mountain itself doesn't want us here." Reverend Matthews clutched his wooden cross tighter, offering silent prayers for protection as they pushed deeper into the earth's hidden chambers. But even his faith was being tested, by the increasingly oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on them from all sides. By late afternoon, after nearly 8 hours of searching, the rescue party had penetrated farther into the cave system than any of them had originally planned. They had found clear evidence that the 12 miners had been in this section of the caves, but they had also discovered something far more troubling: signs that whatever had happened to the missing men was not a simple accident. The trail of abandoned equipment, broken personal belongings, and desperate warnings carved into stone told a story of growing terror that had culminated in some kind of catastrophic event. But what that event might have been remained as mysterious as the fate of the 12 men who had vanished without a trace. As darkness fell once again over the Ozark Mountains, the search party emerged from the caves empty-handed and deeply shaken by what they had discovered. The families of the missing miners gathered around them desperately, hoping for news of their loved ones. But Sheriff Donnelly had only questions to offer, no answers. The mystery of the 12 missing miners had only deepened, and with it grew the fear that whatever had claimed them might still be lurking in the darkness beneath the mountain, waiting for its next victims. The search efforts continued for 3 more days, each expedition venturing deeper into the cave system than the last, and each returning with more questions than answers. The network of tunnels seemed to extend endlessly into the heart of the mountain, branching and reconnecting in patterns that defied easy mapping or comprehension. On the 2nd day of searching, a party led by General John S. Marmaduke himself arrived from Jefferson City. Marmaduke, whose reputation for military leadership had made him a prominent figure throughout Missouri, brought with him a team of experienced miners from the lead deposits around Joplin. His presence lent official aid to the search efforts while also attracting attention from newspapers as far away as St. Louis. "I've seen men lost in cave-ins and gas pockets," Marmaduke told the assembled searchers, "but I've never encountered a situation where 12 experienced men could vanish so completely without leaving some trace of what happened to them." The general's mining experts made several significant discoveries that only deepened the mystery. In one passage, they found evidence that the missing miners had encountered a substantial underground river, one that didn't appear on any existing maps of the region. The river flowed through a chamber so large that their lamplight couldn't reach the far walls, creating an underground cathedral of stone that inspired both awe and terror. More disturbing still, the experts discovered that several passages showed signs of recent collapse, not the gradual settling that typically occurred in limestone caves, but sudden, violent cave-ins that had sealed off entire sections of the tunnel system. The timing of these collapses couldn't be determined precisely, but they appeared to have occurred around the same time the miners had disappeared. "It's as if the mountain itself conspired to trap them," observed Heinrich Weber, a German mining engineer who had accompanied Marmaduke's expedition. "I've never seen geological formations behave in such a coordinated manner." The psychological toll on the search parties was becoming increasingly apparent. Men who had volunteered eagerly on the first day were now reluctant to venture into the deeper passages, reporting strange experiences that they struggled to articulate. Several searchers claimed to have heard voices calling to them from chambers that proved to be empty when investigated. Others described the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, though their lamplight revealed nothing but barred stone walls. Dr. Caldwell, who had been monitoring the health of the search parties, noted a pattern of symptoms among the volunteers that he found deeply troubling. "They're exhibiting signs of extreme psychological distress," he reported to Sheriff Donnelly. "Nightmares, loss of appetite, and a persistent anxiety that seems to worsen with each day they spend in the caves." The local clergy, led by Reverend Matthews, began to suggest that the caves might be under some form of supernatural influence. This theory gained credibility when several search party members reported encountering areas where their compasses spun wildly, pointing in random directions rather than maintaining a consistent bearing toward magnetic north. "There are forces at work here that we don't understand," Matthews declared during a community meeting held on the 3rd day of searching. "Perhaps we should consider that some places are not meant to be disturbed by human presence." But the families of the missing miners refused to abandon hope, even as the evidence mounted that their loved ones had encountered something far more dangerous than a simple mining accident. Sarah McKinnon organized a vigil that lasted throughout the 3rd night, with women from across the region gathering to pray for the safe return of their husbands, fathers, and sons. "They're still alive down there," Sarah insisted, despite the increasingly grim reports from the search parties. "I can feel it. Thomas wouldn't leave me alone with 4 children to raise. He's fighting to come home to us." On the 4th day, The search efforts took a dramatic turn when one of the rescue parties discovered a section of the cave system that appeared to have been deliberately sealed. Stone blocks, clearly shaped by human hands, had been stacked to block a passage that led deeper into the mountain. The workmanship was ancient, possibly predating Yusu's European settlement of the region entirely. The blocks bore carved symbols that none of the searchers could interpret, geometric patterns interwoven with what appeared to be pictographs depicting human figures fleeing from something within the earth. The age of the carvings and the sophistication of the stonework suggested they had been created by Native American artisans, possibly centuries before the current crisis. "The Cherokee were trying to warn us," realized William Harrison, who had joined the search parties despite not being family to any of the missing miners. Those stories about the mountain swallowing light, they weren't just folklore. They were based on real events. General Marmaduke ordered his men to carefully remove the stone blocks, revealing a passage that descended steeply into absolute darkness. The air that emerged from the newly opened tunnel carried a scent that several searchers described as the breath of the grave, a combination of decay, mineral deposits, and something else that made their skin crawl. But as they prepared to explore this newly revealed section of the cave system, one of the search party members made a discovery that changed everything. Carved into the wall beside the ancient seal, in letters that were clearly recent, was a desperate message. "They're coming up. God help us all. TM." The initials could only belong to Thomas McKinnon, the leader of the missing mining party. But the implication of his message, that something had been pursuing the miners from the depths of the mountain, sent chills through everyone who read it. Sheriff Donnelly made the difficult decision to suspend further search efforts until additional resources could be brought in from outside the region. "We're dealing with something beyond our understanding," he announced to the gathered families. "I won't risk losing more men to whatever claimed the Yeshiyo." Verse 12. The decision sparked outrage among the miners' families, but even they had to acknowledge that the evidence suggested their loved ones had encountered something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The ancient seal, the warning message, and the increasingly disturbing reports from search parties all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. The 12 miners had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the mountain for centuries. As the official search efforts came to an end, the mystery of the missing miners was far from solved. If anything, the discoveries made during the 4-day rescue operation had only deepened the enigma while raising new questions about the true nature of the caves and what might be lurking in their deepest recesses. The mountain kept its secrets, as it had for millennia, but the price of that silence had been 12 human lives. And according to Thomas McKinnon's final message, whatever had claimed them was not content to remain buried in the darkness. It was coming up. The theories about what had befallen the 12 miners began to multiply as quickly as autumn leaves falling from the Ozark trees. Each day brought new speculation, ranging from the scientifically plausible to the utterly fantastic, as the community struggled to make sense of a tragedy that seemed to defy rational explanation. Dr. Nathaniel Reeves, a geologist from Washington University in St. Louis, traveled to the site at the request of General Marmaduke to provide a scientific analysis of the cave system. Reeves had studied similar limestone formations throughout Missouri and Arkansas, and his reputation for methodical research gave weight to his eventual conclusions. After spending 2 days examining the cave entrance and studying the reports from the search parties, Reeves proposed what he considered the most likely explanation for the miners' disappearance. "These caves are part of an extensive underground river system," he explained to a gathering of local officials and family members. "It's entirely possible that the miners encountered a sudden flood caused by underground rainfall or the collapse of a natural dam somewhere deeper in the mountain." Reeves's flood theory gained support when he discovered evidence of recent water damage in several passages, mineral deposits that indicated water levels had risen significantly at some point in the recent past. Underground floods can occur without warning in limestone caves, he continued. The water can rise 20 feet in a matter of minutes, trapping anyone who happens to be in the lower passages. But the geologist's rational explanation failed to account for several disturbing pieces of evidence. The ancient stone seal that had been discovered on the fourth day of searching showed no signs of water damage, despite being located in one of the lower passages where flooding would have been most severe. More troubling still, the desperate warnings carved into the cave walls suggested that the miners had been fleeing from something rather than being caught by rising water. Louis Agassiz, the renowned naturalist whose writings on geology were widely respected throughout the scientific community, offered a different perspective when consulted by telegraph about the unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearance. Agassiz suggested that the miners might have encountered pockets of poisonous gas, specifically hydrogen sulfide or carbon dioxide, that had accumulated in the deeper chambers of the cave system. Gas pockets are common in limestone formations, Agassiz's written response explained. These gases are odorless and can overcome victims within seconds, leaving them unable to cry for help or escape to safety. The disorientation caused by gas poisoning could explain the erratic behavior suggested by the abandoned equipment and broken personal belongings. The gas theory seemed plausible until Dr. Caldwell pointed out that the search parties had not encountered any areas where their lamps had dimmed or gone out, a reliable indicator of oxygen depletion that typically accompanied dangerous gas accumulations. Moreover, the carved warnings suggested that the miners had remained conscious and coherent long enough to attempt communication with potential rescuers. As scientific explanations proved inadequate, more supernatural theories began to gain credence among the local population. Reverend Matthews had been studying Cherokee folklore with the help of Joseph Ridge, one of the few Native Americans still living in the region who remembered the old stories about the caves. Ridge, whose grandfather had been a Cherokee medicine man, shared traditions that painted a very different picture of what lay beneath the Ozark Mountains. My grandfather told me that these caves were never meant for the living, Ridge explained through an interpreter. He said they were paths to the underworld, where the spirits of the dead traveled to find their final rest. According to Cherokee tradition, certain caves served as gateways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These sacred sites were protected by ancient spirits who would defend them against intrusion by the living. The stone seal that had been discovered during the search was consistent with Cherokee practices of blocking dangerous passages to prevent accidental trespass into forbidden territory. The symbols on the stones tell the story, Ridge continued. They show people running from the cave mouths, fleeing something that comes from deep in the earth. My grandfather said that sometimes the spirits of the dead become angry when their rest is disturbed, and they take the living back with them to restore the balance. The Cherokee explanation gained unexpected support from Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who had ministered to Hispanic mining families in Colorado before coming to Missouri. Santos had encountered similar stories among Native American communities throughout the Southwest, where caves were often considered sacred sites that required special rituals before they could be safely entered. In my experience, Father Santos told the gathered community leaders, indigenous peoples develop such traditions based on generations of real experience with dangerous phenomena. When they warn against entering certain places, it's usually because their ancestors learned, often at great cost, that those places pose genuine threats. But perhaps the most unsettling theory came from Jeremiah Stone's widow, Martha, who had traveled from Colorado when she learned of her husband's disappearance. Martha revealed information about her husband's background that cast his participation in the mining expedition in an entirely new light. Jeremiah wasn't just a miner, Martha confessed to Sheriff Donnelly in a private interview. He was obsessed with what he called underground civilizations. He believed that there were entire cities hidden beneath the earth, populated by people who had fled there during ancient catastrophes. According to Martha, her husband had spent years searching for evidence of these underground civilizations, convinced that they possessed knowledge and treasures that could revolutionize human society. His mining expeditions had always been covers for his true purpose, exploring cave systems in search of proof that his theories were correct. He told me that he had found signs in caves throughout the West, Martha continued. Ancient tools, worked stone, even written symbols that suggested the presence of organized communities living far beneath the surface. He came to Missouri because he believed the Ozark cave systems might contain the entrance to one of the largest underground civilizations in North America. This revelation cast Jeremiah Stone's insistence on pushing deeper into the cave system in a sinister new light. Rather than simply seeking mineral wealth, he had apparently been pursuing an obsession that had already consumed years of his life. The other 11 miners had been unwitting participants in his quest for something far more dangerous than lead ore. Martha's information also explained some of the more puzzling evidence found during the search efforts. The systematic way the miners had explored the cave system, the abandoned equipment at sites that showed no signs of profitable mining, and the increasingly erratic behavior suggested by the physical evidence all made sense if Stone had been leading them deeper into the mountain in pursuit of his obsessive goal. What if he found what he was looking for? Dr. Caldwell wondered aloud during a meeting of the search organizers. What if there really is something down there that doesn't want to be discovered? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications that no one wanted to contemplate directly. But as the days passed and no trace of the 12 miners emerged, the community was forced to confront the possibility that they had encountered something in the caves that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional human experience. The evidence continued to accumulate. The ancient stone seal, the desperate warnings carved into the cave walls, the systematic way entire passages had collapsed to block access to the deeper chambers, and the complete absence of any human remains despite extensive searching. All of it pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. The 12 miners had discovered something beneath the Ozark Mountains that had been hidden there for a very good reason. And according to Thomas McKinnon's final message, whatever they had found was not content to remain unhidden. It was coming up, seeking the world of the living, drawn perhaps by the disturbance caused by 12 men who had ventured too far into places where humans were never meant to tread. In the weeks following the official end of the search efforts, the families of the 12 missing miners found themselves caught between grief and a desperate hope that refused to die. Without bodies to bury or clear evidence of death, they existed in a limbo that was perhaps more painful than certain loss would have been. Sarah McKinnon had aged years in the span of weeks, her face drawn with exhaustion from sleepless nights spent listening for her husband's footsteps on the porch. She maintained his chair at the dinner table and continued to prepare portions for him, unable to accept that Thomas might never return to claim his place as head of the household. Her 4 children watched her with the confused concern that only comes from seeing a parent struggle with incomprehensible loss. "Mama still thinks Papa's coming home," 8-year-old Elizabeth confided to her teacher, Mrs. Henderson. "She talks to his picture every night before she goes to bed." Mary McKinnon faced additional challenges as her pregnancy advanced. The stress of her husband James's disappearance had triggered complications that Dr. Caldwell feared might endanger both mother and child. The young woman had become increasingly withdrawn, spending hours sitting by her window and scanning the tree line for any sign of the mining party's return. "She's losing weight when she should be gaining," Dr. Caldwell confided to Reverend Matthews. "The grief is literally consuming her from within. Without some form of resolution, I fear we may lose both her and the baby." Greta Mueller had taken a more practical approach to her husband's disappearance, though her stoic demeanor couldn't hide the devastation beneath. He had sold most of the family's livestock to pay mounting debts and had taken in additional laundry work to support her 3 children. Her hands, already rough from years of hard labor, had become cracked and bleeding from the constant washing, but she refused offers of charity from neighbors. "Johann will return," she told anyone who suggested she should accept help. "When he does, he will expect to find his family independent and strong. I will not disappoint him." The Thompson family faced unique challenges as the only African-American members of the missing group. Ezekiel's disappearance had left his wife, Rebecca, and their younger children vulnerable to the racial hostilities that still simmered throughout the region. Several white farmers had already made offers to purchase the Thompson land at prices far below its actual value, clearly expecting desperation to force a quick sale. "They think because Ezekiel's gone, we can't defend what's ours," Rebecca told her 19-year-old daughter, Susan. "But your father didn't work 20 years to build this farm just to have it stolen the moment he couldn't protect it himself." Susan Thompson had inherited her father's strength and determination, but the combined burden of wondering about her father's fate while protecting the family property was taking its toll on the young woman. She had begun carrying her father's shotgun when she went to town, a precaution that drew hostile stares but also deterred potential trouble. The O'Malley women, Bridget and Colleen, had found comfort in their shared Irish Catholic faith, attending daily Mass and organizing prayer vigils that drew participants from across the region. Their strong accents and unfamiliar traditions had initially made them outsiders in the predominantly Protestant community, but their genuine grief had transcended religious differences. "The Blessed Virgin knows the pain of losing someone you love," Bridget explained to the other women who joined their vigils. "She watches over all Moke, hers, who wait for their sons to come home." Father Santos had become a regular presence at these prayer meetings, offering comfort in both English and Spanish to families whose backgrounds spanned multiple cultures and traditions. His acceptance of Cherokee spiritual practices alongside Christian prayers had created a unique form of interfaith worship that reflected the diverse nature of the affected community. Benjamin Carter's wife, Margaret, struggled with particularly complex emotions surrounding her husband's disappearance. As the wife of a preacher, she felt pressure to maintain faith and provide spiritual strength to others, even as her own beliefs were being tested by circumstances that seemed to defy divine justice. "People expect me to have answers," Margaret confided to Dr. Caldwell during a medical visit for stress-related symptoms. "They want me to explain how God could allow 12 good men to simply vanish. But I have no answers, only questions that grow louder every day." The physician had been treating increasing numbers of community members for symptoms related to the ongoing stress of the unexplained disappearance. Sleep disturbances, loss of appetite, and persistent anxiety had become epidemic throughout the region, affecting people who had never met the missing miners, but who couldn't escape the implications of their fate. Samuel Wright's mother, Agnes, had perhaps been hit hardest by the tragedy. Her son had been her sole support since her husband's death at Gettysburg, and his disappearance had left her not only emotionally devastated, but also facing immediate financial ruin. The family's small farm was already mortgaged beyond its value, and without Samuel's labor, she couldn't maintain the crops that represented their only source of income. "He was such a good boy," Agnes told anyone who would listen, "always talking about making his father proud, about taking care of his sisters and me. He wouldn't have gone into those caves if he'd known he might never come out. The Wright sisters, Charity, Hope, and Faith, had been forced to seek employment as domestic servants in Lebanon, working for families who paid them barely enough to survive while their mother slowly lost her grip on reality. The biblical names their parents had chosen for them seemed cruelly ironic as they struggled with circumstances that offered little evidence of divine mercy. William Harrison's disappearance affected the community differently because he had no immediate family to mourn his loss. His status as an orphan had made him a solitary figure throughout his adult life, but his disappearance somehow made his isolation more poignant. Several families began sharing memories of his quiet kindnesses, help offered during harvests, repairs made without being asked, and the gentle way he had treated children and animals. "We never realized how much he mattered until he was gone," reflected Tom Bradley, whose barn Harrison had helped rebuild after a storm damage. "Some people leave big footprints in the world, but Willie left 1,000 small ones that we're just now noticing." As autumn faded into winter, the missing miners' families found themselves facing the approaching holidays with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The thought of celebrating Christmas without their loved ones seemed impossible, yet the children still needed traditions and comfort to help them navigate their confusion and fear. The community response to their need was both touching and practical. Anonymous donations of food and firewood appeared regularly at the homes of the miners' families. Mrs. Henderson organized the school children to create handmade gifts and decorations, while local merchants quietly extended credit for necessities without expectation of immediate payment. But perhaps most meaningful was the decision to hold a special Christmas Eve service dedicated to the missing miners and their families. The service, held at the Methodist Church but welcoming members of all faiths, featured readings from multiple religious traditions and included prayers in English, German, and Cherokee languages. Reverend Matthews delivered a sermon that acknowledged the community's struggle with faith in the face of incomprehensible loss. "We gather tonight not because we have answers," he said, "but because we refuse to let mystery and fear destroy the bonds that hold us together as neighbors and friends." The service concluded with the lighting of 12 candles, one for each missing miner, while the congregation sang hymns in the various languages represented among the families. As the candles flickered in the darkness of the church, many felt a sense of connection to the men who had vanished beneath the mountain, as if their spirits were somehow present in the warm glow of the flames. But even as the community came together to support the miners' families, questions about their fate continued to multiply. Strange reports began filtering in from other parts of the Ozarks. Stories of unexplained sounds emanating from cave mouths, of livestock refusing to graze near certain limestone formations, and of travelers who claimed to have seen lights moving deep underground where no lights should exist. The mountain kept its secrets, but those secrets seemed to be stirring, as if the disturbance caused by the 12 missing miners had awakened something that would not easily return to sleep. The family's grief had become part of a larger mystery that threatened to consume not just their peace of mind, but their very sense of reality itself. In the months that followed the disappearance of the 12 miners, the Ozark Mountains began to acquire a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of Missouri and Arkansas. Newspapers from St. Louis to New Orleans carried accounts of the mysterious vanishing, each retelling adding new layers of speculation and folklore to an already complex story. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat, which had established itself as the region's most respected newspaper, assigned its best investigative reporter, Jonathan Marcus, to follow the story. Marcus spent weeks in the affected communities, interviewing witnesses and examining the physical evidence left behind by the search parties. His series of articles, published throughout the winter of 1874 and 1875, brought national attention to the case while also contributing to its mythological status. Marcus had a talent for atmospheric description that transformed his factual reporting into something approaching literature, creating images that lingered in readers' minds long after they had finished the newspaper. There is something about these particular mountains that seems to resist human understanding, Marcus wrote in his most widely quoted piece. The caves exhale mystery with every breath of cool air that emerges from their limestone throats. Local residents speak in whispers of ancient curses and spirits that guard the underground realm with jealous fury. The newspaper coverage attracted attention from curiosity seekers and would-be treasure hunters who traveled to the region hoping to solve the mystery themselves, or to claim whatever riches the miners might have discovered. Local authorities, led by Sheriff Donnelly, found themselves overwhelmed by requests to explore the caves, most of them from people who had no understanding of the dangers involved. "We've had everyone from university professors to circus performers asking for permission to go into those caves," Donnelly complained to General Marmaduke during one of their regular correspondence sessions. "Half of them think they're going to find the miners sitting around a campfire waiting to be rescued, and the other half are convinced there's a fortune in gold just waiting to be picked up off the cave floor." The influx of outsiders created tensions within the local community, particularly among the miners' families, who felt that their tragedy was being exploited for entertainment and profit. Sarah McKinnon became increasingly bitter about the attention, especially after several newspaper reporters attempted to interview her children about their father's disappearance. "They treat our pain like it's some kind of show," she told Reverend Matthews during one of their counseling sessions. "They ask questions about Thomas like he was a character in one of their adventure stories, not a real man with a real family who's worried sick about him." The commercial exploitation became even more offensive when a traveling showman named Professor Edmund Blackwood arrived in Lebanon claiming to possess supernatural abilities that would allow him to contact the spirits of the missing miners. Blackwood set up a tent near the cave entrance and charged admission for seances, where he claimed to channel messages from the men trapped underground. "Your husband wants you to know he's safe," Blackwood told Mary McKinnon during one of these sessions, speaking in a theatrical whisper, while his assistant created mysterious sounds from behind a curtain. "He says he's found something wonderful down there, but he can't return until the spirits give him permission." Dr. Caldwell attended one of Blackwood's performances and was appalled by what he witnessed. "The man is nothing but a charlatan preying on desperate people," he reported to local authorities. "He's taking money from families who can barely afford food, selling them false hope manufactured from thin air." Sheriff Donnelly eventually ran Blackwood out of town, but not before the showman had collected substantial sums from people whose judgment had been compromised by grief and desperation. The incident left the community even more suspicious of outsiders and more protective of their privacy. However, not all outside attention proved harmful. Professor William James of Harvard University, who was conducting research into what he termed psychical phenomena, wrote to local authorities requesting permission to study the psychological effects of the unexplained disappearance on the affected community. James's approach was more respectful and scientific than most outsiders had shown. He spent several weeks in the region, not trying to solve the mystery of the missing miners, but rather studying how communities adapt to traumatic events that defy rational explanation. His subsequent academic papers would become classics in the emerging field of social psychology. What we observe here is a community in the process of creating new mythologies to explain experiences that fall outside their existing frameworks of understanding, James wrote in his landmark study. The human mind, when confronted with inexplicable loss, tends to construct narratives that restore some sense of meaning and control, even if those narratives incorporate supernatural elements. James's work helped establish the theoretical foundation for understanding how traumatic events become transformed into folklore, a process that was clearly visible in the evolving stories about the 12 missing miners. Each retelling added new details, most of them unverifiable, but all serving to make the story more compelling and meaningful to those who shared it. Local storytellers began incorporating the miners' disappearance into existing Ozark folklore, creating connections between the recent tragedy and older legends about the mountain's supernatural properties. The cave system where the men had vanished became known as Devil's Throat, a name that reflected both its ominous appearance and its reputation as a gateway to the underworld. Children throughout the region grew up hearing cautionary tales about the dangers of exploring caves without proper preparation and respect for the ancient spirits that guarded them. Parents used the story of the 12 miners as a warning against the kind of reckless ambition that could lead to tragic consequences. "Don't go poking around in places you don't understand," became a common refrain among Ozark parents. "The mountain remembers every slight, and it always collects its debts." The legend began to attract a different kind of visitor. People who were drawn to the mystery not for treasure or fame, but because they felt a genuine connection to the spiritual dimensions of the story. These visitors, often described as seekers or pilgrims, came to the cave entrance to meditate, pray, or simply pay their respects to the men who had vanished into the mountain's depths. Some of these visitors reported unusual experiences during their vigils. Sensations of being watched by unseen presences, dreams filled with underground rivers and limestone cathedrals, and occasionally the faint sound of voices calling from somewhere deep within the earth. While skeptics dismissed these accounts as products of suggestion and imagination, the accumulation of similar reports from independent witnesses created a body of testimony that was difficult to ignore entirely. Joseph Ridge, the Cherokee elder who had shared his grandfather's stories about the caves, became an informal guardian of the site, offering traditional blessings for those who wished to honor the missing miners while warning against any attempts to penetrate the sealed passages. His presence helped maintain a sense of reverence around the location, while also serving as a bridge between Native American spiritual traditions and the newer legends that were developing among European settlers. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the families of the 12 Minpins heirs faced a painful decision about how to commemorate their loss. Without bodies to bury or clear evidence of death, traditional funeral services seemed inappropriate, yet they needed some form of ritual closure to help them move forward with their lives. The solution came from an unexpected source: Martha Stone, Jeremiah's widow, who had remained in the region to search for answers about her husband's fate. Despite the revelation that Jeremiah had deceived the other miners about his true motives for exploring the caves, Martha felt a deep sense of responsibility for the tragedy that had resulted from his obsession. "My husband led those men to their fate," she told the gathered families during a community meeting. "I can't bring them back, but I can help ensure they're remembered properly." Martha used her modest savings to commission a memorial stone that would be erected near the cave entrance, bearing the names of all 12 missing miners and the date of their disappearance. The memorial would serve both as a tribute to their memory and as a warning to future generations about the dangers that lurked beneath the mountains. The dedication ceremony, held on October 15, 1875, drew hundreds of people from across the Ozarks. The service combined Christian prayers with Cherokee blessings, reflecting the diverse cultural heritage of the region while honoring the universal human need to remember those who have been lost. As Reverend Matthews spoke the final prayer, a gentle wind stirred the autumn leaves around the memorial stone, creating a sound like whispered voices rising from the earth itself. Many of those present felt that the 12 miners were somehow present for their memorial, their spirits finally at peace after a year of uncertainty and searching. But even as the community found a measure of closure in the memorial ceremony, the legend of the 12 missing miners continued to grow and evolve. The mountain had claimed them as its own, and in doing so, had become part of a story that would outlive everyone who had known the men personally. They had become symbols of humanity's eternal struggle against the unknown, their names forever linked to the mysteries that lie hidden beneath the Earth's surface. As winter approached in 1875, nearly 13 months after the 12 miners had vanished into the limestone depths of the Ozark Mountains, the legend of their disappearance had taken root so deeply in regional consciousness that it seemed to have always been part of the landscape. The story had evolved beyond simple tragedy into something approaching mythology, complete with moral lessons, supernatural elements, and the kind of ambiguous ending that allows each generation to interpret it according to their own fears and beliefs. The cave entrance itself had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors who came not to solve the mystery, but to experience whatever spiritual or emotional resonance they might find in contemplating the unknown fate of 12 ordinary men who had descended into extraordinary circumstances. The memorial stone, erected by Martha Stone, served as a focal point for these visits. Its simple inscription, 12 souls entered the darkness, October 15, 1874, capturing both the factual reality and the symbolic weight of their disappearance. Local residents had developed an elaborate etiquette around the site, with unwritten rules about appropriate behavior and timing for visits. Dawn and dusk were considered the most appropriate times for paying respects, while midday visits were discouraged as somehow disrespectful to the solemn nature of the location. Flowers and small tokens were often left at the memorial, creating informal shrines that were regularly tended by family members and community volunteers. The physical changes to the cave system itself had become part of the legend. The passages that had been sealed during the search efforts remained blocked, with local authorities maintaining that the structural instability discovered during the rescue attempts made further exploration too dangerous to permit. However, this official explanation satisfied no one who had actually witnessed the systematic way entire sections of the cave network had collapsed, as if the mountain itself had decided to protect its secrets from further intrusion. Dr. Caldwell, now in his 70s and serving as the region's unofficial historian of the tragedy, had spent years documenting the various theories and accounts surrounding the disappearance. His meticulous records included not only the factual details of the search efforts, but also the more speculative elements that had emerged over time. Reports of strange lights visible through cracks in the limestone, accounts of voices heard echoing from sealed passages, and the persistent stories of livestock and wildlife avoiding the area around the cave entrance. What we're witnessing, Caldwell wrote in his private journal, is the transformation of historical event into cultural mythology. The facts of what happened to those 12 men may never be known, but the meaning their disappearance has acquired for this community has become perhaps more important than the facts themselves. The seasonal rhythms of Ozark life had incorporated the anniversary of the disappearance into the community calendar. October 15th had become an unofficial day of remembrance when families throughout the region would gather for quiet dinners and share stories about the missing miners, many of whom had become more vivid as characters in local folklore than they had ever been as living men. Children who had been born after the tragedy grew up knowing the names and stories of the 12 miners as if they had been historical figures from the distant past rather than neighbors and friends of their parents. The tale had acquired the kind of narrative polish that comes from countless retellings, with each storyteller emphasizing different aspects of the mystery according to their own perspective and audience. Thomas McKinnon had become the tragic hero of the story, the responsible leader whose final warning carved into the cave wall represented his commitment to protecting others, even in the face of his own doom. James McKinnon was remembered as the war-damaged veteran seeking redemption through honest work, while Johann Müller embodied the immigrant dream cut short by forces beyond human understanding. The Thompson family's story had taken on particular significance within the region's evolving understanding of racial justice. Ezekiel and David Thompson were remembered as men who had faced down both earthly prejudice and supernatural terror with equal courage, their participation in the mining expedition serving as a symbol of the shared humanity that transcended social divisions. The O'Malley brothers had become representatives of the Irish immigrant experience, their names invoked whenever the community discussed the contributions made by newcomers who had brought their own traditions and skills to the Ozark wilderness. Their wives' vigils and prayer circles had evolved into an annual tradition that brought together people of all faiths and backgrounds. Benjamin Carter's story resonated particularly with those who struggled to reconcile religious faith with the harsh realities of frontier life. His decision to abandon his ministerial duties in pursuit of worldly wealth had been transformed in folklore into a parable about the dangers of losing sight of spiritual values, while his presence among the missing miners was seen as evidence that divine judgment operated according to mysterious principles that humans could not hope to understand. Samuel Wright had become the symbol of youth cut down before its potential could be realized, his story told as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to cherish each day with family and community. His sisters had eventually married and moved away from the region, but they returned annually for the memorial service, ensuring that his memory remained alive in the place where he had grown up. William Harrison's transformation from solitary orphan to beloved community member had occurred entirely posthumously, as people remembered small kindnesses and quiet contributions that had gone largely unnoticed during his lifetime. His story had become a reminder about the importance of recognizing the value of every individual, regardless of their social status or family connections. Jeremiah Stone remained the most controversial figure in the collective memory of the tragedy. Some blamed him entirely for leading the other men to their doom, while others saw him as a visionary who had simply been ahead of his time in recognizing the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the earth's surface. His widow Martha had become a respected member of the community, but she continued to carry the burden of her husband's role in the disaster that had claimed 12 lives. As the 1870s drew to a close, the legend of the missing miners had begun to influence practical decisions about development and exploration throughout the Ozark region. Mining operations in limestone cave systems were approached with much greater caution, and local authorities required extensive safety precautions that went far beyond what had been considered necessary before the tragedy. The Cherokee traditions that Joseph Ridge had shared during the crisis had gained new respect among European settlers, who began to understand that indigenous knowledge about the landscape represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about natural hazards and spiritual protocols. The integration of Native American perspectives into local folklore had created a richer and more complex understanding of the relationship between human communities and the natural world. Professor William James had published several academic papers based on his study of the community's response to the unexplained disappearance, contributing to a growing body of scholarly work about the psychological and social functions of folklore in American society. His research had helped establish the theoretical framework for understanding how communities process traumatic events that fall outside conventional explanations. The influence of the legend extended beyond the immediate region through the continuing newspaper coverage and the accounts of visitors who carried the story back to their own communities. Elements of the Ozark cave tragedy began appearing in folklore from other parts of the country, adapted to local circumstances but retaining the core themes of hubris punished, mysteries that demanded respect, and the thin boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond human understanding. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the 12 missing miners was the way their story had taught the surrounding community about the importance of humility in the face of natural forces that humans could neither fully understand nor completely control. The Ozark Mountains had always been a place where survival depended on respecting the power of the wilderness, but the tragedy of 1874 had added a new dimension to that understanding. The mountain itself seemed to have absorbed the 12 men into its own ancient narrative, making them part of a story that had been unfolding for millions of years before humans arrived in the region and would continue lie. Long after the last human voice had fallen silent, they had become part of the mountain's memory, their names and stories preserved in stone and stream, in the whispered warnings passed from parent to child, and in the eternal vigilance of a community that had learned to listen carefully to the voices that spoke from the darkness. In the end, the mystery of what had happened to the 12 miners on that October day in 1874 remained unsolved, but it had ceased to be simply a mystery. It had become something larger and more enduring, a legend that spoke to the fundamental human experience of confronting the unknown and the unknowable. The caves still breathed their cool, damp air into the Ozark wilderness, exhaling secrets that would never be fully revealed. The memorial stone stood sentinel at the entrance to Devil's Throat, bearing the names of 12 men who had descended into darkness and emerged into legend. And somewhere in the limestone depths beneath the mountains, in chambers that human eyes might never see again, the echo of their final moments continued to reverberate through the eternal darkness, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some places in this world belong to forces older and more powerful than human ambition or understanding. The mountain remembered everything, and it kept its promises to both the living and the dead. The 12 miners had sought fortune beneath the earth and had found something far more valuable and far more terrible. They had found their place in the eternal story of humanity's relationship with the mysteries that lie hidden in the dark places of the world. Their names lived on in stone and story, in whispered warnings and respectful silence, in the gentle wind that stirred the leaves around their memorial, and in the patient darkness that waited beneath the mountain for the next chapter of an Anansi, and tale that would never truly end. They had become part of something larger than themselves, part of the living mythology of a land that had always known how to transform human tragedy into eternal truth. And in the deepest chambers of the cave system, where no light had penetrated since the world was young, something stirred in response to their names being spoken, something that remembered their courage and their fear, their hopes and their final desperate warnings carved into stone. The mountain had claimed them, but it had also honored them, making them guardians of mysteries that were too dangerous for the living world to bear. The legend of the 12 miners would outlive everyone who had known them personally, but it would never lose the essential human truth at its core. The truth that some sacrifices transcend individual tragedy to become part of the collective wisdom that guides communities through the darkness toward whatever dawn might await them. They had entered the caves as ordinary men seeking ordinary fortune, but they had emerged as something far more valuable, as teachers whose final lesson was carved in stone and sealed in darkness, waiting for each new generation to discover its meaning for themselves. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.